"You're making a mistake, Marcus." Renata Voss said it the way she said everything in a boardroom, flat, unhurried, like she was reading a forecast rather than issuing a threat. "When the money runs out, and it will, don't call this office. There won't be anything left here for you." Marcus Alden didn't answer. He picked up his bag and he walked. To understand why a man would walk away from a company worth $11 billion with nothing but a duffel bag and a set of keys, he no longer had a house for you had to go back 11 years. To a cramped studio apartment on the south side of Chicago, where a 26-year-old systems engineer named Marcus Alden was rebuilding a bank's fraud detection engine from a laptop balanced on a milk crate because he couldn't afford a desk. Marcus had grown up 2 neighborhoods over, raised by a mother who worked nights at a hospital laundry facility and a grandfather who fixed radios for anyone on the block who asked, for free, because he said a mind that solves problems and hoards the solving isn't worth much. Marcus inherited that conviction more than he inherited anything else. He was the first person in his family to finish college, the only black engineer on 3 separate teams before he turned 30. And the kind of quiet people mistook for shyness, until they watched him take apart a system that had stumped a room of senior architects and hand it back running by the afternoon. He didn't chase title, and he turned down 2 relocation offers from firms that wanted him in San Francisco, because he cared more about whether a system held together under pressure than about whose name sat above his on an org chart. That decision would cost him more than he could have imagined, and it would also, eventually, be the only thing that saved him. He met Renata Voss at a Fintech summit in Miami. She was on stage pitching a concept she called Cordant, a peer-to-peer payment platform meant to undercut the transaction fees of every major processor in the country. Her slides were sharp. Her delivery was sharper. Investors in the front row were already reaching for their phones before she finished her second sentence. Marcus watched from the back of the room and counted 4 structural problems in her proposed architecture before she'd even gotten to the demo. He wasn't trying to be difficult. It was simply how his mind worked. He couldn't watch a system get described without instinctively finding its fault lines. After the panel, he found her near the coffee station and told her, plainly, what wouldn't survive contact with real transaction volume. Most founders bristled at that kind of thing from a stranger. Renata didn't. She handed him a badge-scanned business card and said, "Prove it. Buy me 20 minutes." 20 minutes became 4 hours. Marcus missed his connecting flight home and didn't especially mind. What followed felt, for a long time, like the best decision of his life. Renata had the charisma and the narrative instinct to make a room of skeptical venture capitalists believe they were early to something enormous. What she didn't have, what she'd been quietly hiring and firing contractors to try to get for 18 months, was an engineer who could actually build the thing she was describing. Marcus rebuilt Cordant's settlement engine from the ground up over 4 months of nights and weekends, unpaid at first, because he said he wanted to see if the idea was real before he asked to be compensated for making it real. He redesigned the ledger reconciliation system so it could scale past the volume Renata's own projections called for. He closed a set of authentication gaps in the original build that would have let a moderately skilled attacker drain linked bank accounts within the platform's first year of public use. And the way an engineer sometimes leaves a private mark on work he's proud of, he wrote a short identifying string into the core authorization module. Nothing anyone browsing the code casually would notice, just a personal convention buried in a comment block, a habit he'd carried from earlier jobs. He didn't think of it as insurance. At the time, it was closer to a signature on the underside of a piece of furniture, something meant for no one but himself. They married 18 months after Cordant's first outside funding round closed. For years, Renata was generous with the credit, at least out loud. She told investors in early pitch meetings that Cordant existed because of the man sitting next to her. She told her own family the same thing at dinner. Marcus built a version of his identity around those sentences, the way you build a house on a foundation you never think to inspect, because why would you, when the person pouring it is your wife? Cordant grew faster than either of them had projected. It expanded into 6 countries in under 3 years. User accounts crossed 40 million, then 80. By the time analysts started using words like unicorn, and then, later, IPO candidate, Renata Voss was the face on magazine covers and morning shows, profiled as one of the most significant founders of her generation. Marcus was, by every public account, simply her husband, the quiet one who used to be technical, before the company got serious. The shift happened the way most erosion happens, slowly enough that you keep telling yourself you're imagining it. First, he stopped being looped into architecture reviews. Then his access to core production systems was quietly downgraded, framed as routine hardening ahead of a compliance audit. Then, at company events, she began introducing him only as her husband, no mention of the 4 years he'd spent as the platform's sole architect. When he raised it, she told him he was being oversensitive, that the engineering org she'd since built was more sophisticated than Cordant's early days, that his original build was foundational, sure, but long since replaced underneath layers he wouldn't recognize anymore. She said it kindly. She said it like a diagnosis she'd rehearsed, and for longer than he was proud of, he almost believed her. What he did not know during any of that slow unraveling was that Renata had been involved for close to 2 years with Preston Cade, Cordant's chief operating officer, a man with an expensive haircut and the specific talent of making every room believe he'd been the smartest person in it before he'd said a word. Renata and Preston wanted the IPO to be uncomplicated. They wanted the founding story to be hers alone, a self-made visionary, a decade of singular leadership, no inconvenient husband in the background asking why his name wasn't on a single patent filing. A divorce was the cleanest way to make that happen, provided Marcus disappeared quietly and signed the appropriate paperwork on the way out. The settlement Renata's legal team drafted was, on paper, generous. He'd keep the townhouse in Evanston. He'd receive support payments for 3 years. In exchange, he'd sign a non-disclosure agreement covering Preston, the circumstances of the marriage's collapse, and, critically, buried in subclause language designed to be skimmed past, any discussion whatsoever of his role in founding or building Cordant. His name, it turned out, wasn't on a single patent. It wasn't on the original incorporation documents either. Renata had handled all of that years earlier, quietly, in ways he'd never thought to double-check because he trusted her completely. On paper, Marcus Alden had built nothing. He was simply a man she'd once been married to. When he told her he wouldn't sign without renegotiating the NDA, she looked at him with something close to pity. "You have no standing," she said. "No patent has your name on it. If you want to make this difficult, we can, but you'll run out of money long before I run out of attorneys." Preston delivered a cruder version of the same message through a mutual acquaintance a few days later. "Sign it. Take the townhouse. Disappear." Marcus spent 3 sleepless nights reading every page of what they'd offered, not because he intended to accept it, but because he needed to understand precisely what he was about to refuse. On the 4th morning, he called his attorney and told her to schedule the final hearing. He was going to sign the divorce decree. He was not going to take a single dollar of what Renata was offering him to buy his silence. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse in downtown Chicago was busier than he'd expected. A business reporter had tipped off 2 outlets, and a small cluster of photographers had already assembled outside by the time Marcus arrived with a single duffel bag and no umbrella, though it wasn't raining. Inside, Renata sat at the center of a long table with 4 attorneys arranged around her like satellites, composed and camera-ready in charcoal. Preston wasn't permitted in the courtroom, but Marcus had no doubt he was somewhere nearby, close enough to hear how it went. Marcus noticed, without thinking much of it at the time, a man seated alone in the back row. Dark suit, no press credential, no notepad, no phone in hand. He sat with the stillness of someone who had already decided what he was going to do once the proceedings ended, and was simply waiting for the moment to arrive. The hearing itself moved quickly. When the judge confirmed the terms of the proposed settlement and asked Marcus to acknowledge it, he stood and said clearly that he was waiving the townhouse, the support payments, and the entire financial settlement as written. Renata's lead attorney looked up sharply from her notes. Renata herself went very still. The judge asked him to confirm. He confirmed. He reached into his jacket, set his wedding ring on the table in front of him, and looked at Renata for what he intended to be the final time. "Keep the company," he said. "Keep the man you chose, but you don't get to buy my silence with things that were never really yours to give in the first place." She recovered fast, he'd give her that. By the time he'd picked up his bag and turned toward the doors, her expression had already rearranged itself into something performing sympathy for the room. "When you're out of options," she said, just loud enough to carry, "there won't be a second offer." He kept walking. Outside, the photographers shouted questions he had no intention of answering. He was halfway down the courthouse steps when he heard it. A low vibration first, felt in the chest before it registered as sound, then unmistakably the deep roar of a large jet descending. Every head on the steps tilted upward at once. A Gulf Stream, marked with the insignia of Hale Industrial, a conglomerate whose footprint made Cordant look like a regional experiment, was coming in low over the skyline toward the private airfield a quarter-mile from the courthouse. The man from the back row of the courtroom appeared at the bottom of the steps as the aircraft touched down. He walked directly past Renata, who had spent 2 years and considerable money trying and failing to secure even 15 minutes with Augustus Hale, and stopped an arm's length from Marcus. "Mr. Alden," he said, "my name is Nadia Coral's colleague. My name is Desmond Fitch. I'm senior counsel to Mr. Augustus Hale. He has been trying to find you for 9 years. This aircraft is here for you." The cameras kept rolling. Somewhere behind him, Marcus heard Renata's voice lose the composure it had held all morning. Fitch held out a folder. A summary of wire transfers moved in the 6 weeks before the hearing, from Cordant subsidiary accounts into a network of holding companies, registered under names connected to Preston Cade. If what the folder described was accurate, Renata had concealed assets from the court, which meant the settlement Marcus had just signed, NDA included, rested on a fraudulent foundation a judge could set aside entirely. He stood there for a long moment with the morning light on his face, and the sound of idling engines behind Fitch, weighing 2 versions of the rest of his year. In one, he drove to the small apartment he'd rented for the week and began figuring out what a quiet life looked like from nothing. In the other, he handed Fitch his bag. The aircraft leveled out somewhere above Lake Michigan, before Fitch sat across from him and began to explain. Augustus Hale, 74 years old, founder of 3 separate industrial empires, had spent close to a decade trying to locate a systems contractor who had, 9 years earlier, spent a single overnight shift at a children's hospital in Baltimore that Hale's family foundation quietly funded. Marcus remembered that night with more clarity than almost anything else from that period of his life. He'd been in Baltimore on a 2-week staffing contract, patching an aging hospital network, when the monitoring system flagged an intrusion at 2 a.m. Ransomware, already locking file systems tied to dialysis scheduling and ventilator monitoring on 2 floors. The hospital's IT staff were unreachable. He was the only person on site with the access and knowledge to isolate it. He worked alone for 6 hours, cutting the compromised systems off without triggering a shutdown that would have taken the ventilators offline with it, restoring from clean backups floor by floor. By the time the real security team arrived at 7, it was contained. He didn't wait around for credit, just signed the contractor logbook with an initial and an employee ID from an agency that folded 8 months later, then caught a flight to a job he was already running late for. He hadn't known that a 5-year-old girl on that ventilator floor that night was Augustus Hale's granddaughter. He hadn't known Hale had spent years afterward trying to trace the anonymous contractor who kept her monitoring systems online through the worst 6 hours of that hospital's decade. The staffing agency's records had been incomplete, the logbook signature illegible, the trail cold more times than not. It was a facial recognition match against a business press photo from a Cordant funding announcement, run through an investigative team Hale had never stopped funding, that had finally connected the initials in a 9-year-old logbook to a name. "He knew about your work at Cordant too," Fitch said. "Once we identified you, we looked into everything connected to your name, including what your wife has done with it." He opened a second folder, What Marcus read over the next hour was a documented account of a theft he'd spent years being persuaded hadn't happened. Structural patterns in Cordant's authorization architecture, naming conventions, an error-handling approach carried over from a prior job, were provably his, present in every version of the code because you cannot fully rebuild a complex system without carrying its foundation forward. The signature he'd embedded years earlier was still there, untouched, buried too deep to remove without restructuring the entire authentication layer. The patent filings listed Renata as sole inventor. A metadata comparison between the official documentation and an early backup from a third-party server Cordant had used in its first year showed his name throughout the original file, and none in the version filed with the patent office. And then there were the transfers. In the 2 months before the divorce hearing, roughly $290 million had moved out of Cordant subsidiary accounts into a chain of holding entities that, traced through several layers of registration, led back to a trust Preston had quietly established 18 months earlier. Renata had disclosed a fraction of that to the court. The rest had been concealed with a level of structural precision that required deliberate planning, not oversight. There was one more thing, Fitch told him. After sidelining Marcus, Renata had let Preston's engineering team rebuild Cordant's settlement layer ahead of the IPO to handle the trading surge a public listing would bring. The team doing the rebuild didn't fully understand the architecture underneath the layer they were modifying, the layer Marcus had built, and in reworking it without accounting for what sat beneath, they'd introduced a flaw that wouldn't show up under normal load. Under IPO day trading volume, though, the interface between the original encryption layer and the new settlement system would fail a handshake sequence, and for a window of several minutes before the whole system crashed, expose the live financial data of millions of users to the open network. They hadn't caught it. They couldn't have. Catching it required understanding the original structure at a depth none of them had ever been given access to. Augustus Hale's estate sat outside Milwaukee, unshowy in the way old, enormous money often is. He shook Marcus's hand with a grip that made clear he wasn't a man who performed gratitude he didn't mean, and thanked him for that night in Baltimore like someone who'd rehearsed the moment for years and had decided not to waste it on extra words. In his study, Hale laid out the choice plainly. Marcus could file an emergency motion immediately, theft of intellectual property, fraudulent concealment of assets. Renata, to protect the IPO timeline, would likely settle fast and quietly. He'd walk away wealthy, and she'd keep her company and most of her story. Or he could wait until the morning of the IPO, walk into court with the embedded signature and the vulnerability documentation, and file for an emergency injunction. The listing would halt. Regulators would open an investigation. Everything would become public, and the flaw that could expose millions of users on the platform's highest traffic day in history would be caught before it did any damage. It wasn't a difficult decision, but Marcus made himself sit with it honestly anyway. He thought about every engineer who'd watched Renata take sole credit for a decade and never said anything because it wasn't their fight. He thought about the users trusting the platform with their financial data, unaware that the person who understood the system deeply enough to catch what was wrong in it had been the one removed from the building. "I didn't get on that plane for the money," he told Hale. "I got on it to put my name back where it belongs." Hale nodded once, and Fitch started making calls. The attorney Hale retained, Camille Doyle, treated every conversation like a cross-examination she was already running. She was blunt to the point of discomfort, and Marcus respected her for it almost immediately. She read through the NDA he'd signed at the courthouse and set it down like she'd already solved it. "It's a condition of the settlement agreement," she said. Renata concealed close to $300 million from the court. That makes her asset disclosure fraudulent. Fraudulent disclosure makes the whole settlement voidable. When the settlement goes, the NDA attached to it goes with it. You're free to testify to everything you know. What followed were 2 weeks that felt less like legal preparation and more like reconstruction. Doyle drilled him for hours daily, hunting for every weakness in his position before opposing counsel could find it first. "You left voluntarily. You signed voluntarily. "You waived the settlement voluntarily," she told him in one session. "From where a judge sits, you look like a man unhappy with choices he made himself. Convince me otherwise." Explaining it to her forced him to say out loud, for the first time, the full shape of what had happened, the deliberate stripping of access, the slow redefinition of his own contribution, until he'd nearly talked himself into believing it. Doyle listened without expression, then told him to stop explaining how it felt and start explaining, in verifiable technical terms, what he actually knew. That was when he went back into the code. Reading through Cordant's original architecture again felt like reading something he'd written and then been told he hadn't. Every structural decision had a reason he could still recite from memory. The authentication signature sat exactly where he'd left it 9 years earlier. And the vulnerability in the rebuilt settlement layer revealed itself to him within 20 minutes of examining the current build, precisely because he still understood the foundation underneath it better than anyone Preston had hired since. 3 days before the IPO date, Fitch's team recovered an email from a backup server Cordant's cleanup crew had missed. A message Renata had sent Marcus 7 years earlier at nearly midnight in the company's first hard year, telling him plainly that Cordant would not exist without him and that she needed him to know she meant it. Doyle read it once and set it down. "That's useful," she said. It became, at that point, their single strongest piece of documentary evidence. Then, the night before the IPO, most of what they'd built collapsed in under 4 hours. The secure server holding their evidence was breached, a targeted intrusion aimed specifically at the source code logs, the metadata comparisons, and the email archive. Backups were corrupted before the intrusion was even detected. The independent technical consultant who'd agreed to verify the authentication signature called Doyle's office that same afternoon and withdrew, citing personal reasons. After a wire transfer traced 3 steps removed from Preston's trust reached his personal account that morning. Renata's team put out a statement accusing Marcus of fabricating evidence and weaponizing Hale's resources against a woman who had, in their words, given him more in the settlement than the law required and more than he deserved. At 9 that night, Augustus Hale was taken to a hospital with chest pain. His doctors were careful with their language. The press wasn't. By 10, 3 outlets had run a version of the same story. A disgruntled ex-husband, backed by an aging billionaire whose support had just collapsed on the eve of a legal challenge his own legal team could no longer substantiate. Renata called at 11:15. "I'll offer this once," she said. $8 million. You withdraw every filing, issue a statement retracting the allegations, and you walk away from all of it. A pause. "You left that courthouse with a duffel bag and nothing else. If you say no tonight, Marcus, that's still all you'll have tomorrow." He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after she hung up. He thought about the $8 million. He thought about Doyle's face when she told him the files were gone. He thought about the users who had no idea what had been built into the platform they trusted every day. Then he walked to the desk where he'd left his original case materials and found the one thing that had never been digitized. Because he'd printed it years ago from a personal backup, and no one had thought to look for paper. 14 pages of the original source code annotated in his own handwriting. On page 9 in the header comment block of the authentication module, the signature sat exactly where he'd left it. Renata could seize the servers. She could buy off a witness. She could erase every digital trace that existed. But the architecture itself, the logic, the structural knowledge of how the system worked and precisely what happened when someone modified it without understanding what it carried, that lived in his head. It always had. No one had ever managed to take it, no matter how many years they'd spent telling him it no longer mattered. He called Doyle at midnight and told her they weren't withdrawing anything. He didn't need the missing documents. He was going to walk into that courtroom in the morning and prove in real time that he'd built the system, because he was the only person left who still fully understood it. "Be there at 8, she said. "The exchange opens at 9:30. He was in the courtroom at 8, carrying 14 printed pages, and a laptop Doyle's team had spent the night configuring with a clean testing environment. Across the room, Renata's legal team occupied their table with the ease of people who believed the morning was a formality. A final gesture from an opponent who'd already lost his evidence, his witness, and his backer. Their lead attorney, a man named Halloran who wore 30 years of litigation experience like a second suit, didn't look up when Marcus walked in. At that same moment on the floor of the exchange, Renata stood at the ceremonial podium in white, pressed in a step behind her left shoulder, camera flashes catching the practiced angle of her chin as she gripped the bell handle. Cordant opened at $51 a share. Within minutes it had climbed past 55. Doyle didn't offer an opening argument in the traditional sense. She stood, stated the nature of the filing, sat back down and nodded at Marcus. No framing, no narrative. The evidence was going to speak in a language only one person in the room fully understood. "Your Honor," he said, standing, "I intend to demonstrate two things this morning. First, that I am the original architect of Cordant's core payment system. Second, that the current version of that system contains a critical vulnerability that will activate under today's trading conditions and expose the financial data of millions of users. I can show the court both, using the system itself." Halloran objected, a last-minute, bad-faith maneuver from a disgruntled ex-spouse with no standing and no credible evidence. The judge noted it and told Marcus to proceed. He connected the laptop to the courtroom display, pulled up the platform's current public codebase, and navigated to the authentication module without notes, without documentation, without hesitation. "There's a string embedded in this file," he said. "It has been present in every version of this software since the original build, because removing it would require rebuilding the authentication layer around it. It identifies the original author of this module." He ran a single command. The string resolved on screen. His initials, exactly as he'd written them 9 years earlier. The room went quiet in a particular way, not the silence of nothing happening, but of people who just watched something they didn't yet have a category for. The court's own appointed technical consultant confirmed on questioning that the string's format, placement, and the logic surrounding it were consistent with original authorship. Halloran argued it proved familiarity, not ownership. Doyle, without standing, said simply that they weren't finished. Marcus moved to the settlement layer Preston's team had rebuilt and walked the court through the flaw the way you'd walk someone through a building with a structural crack, pointing at the wall and explaining what it was supposed to hold up. He set the testing environment's transaction volume to match Cordant's own investor projections for its first hour of public trading and ran it. 40 seconds in, the system began throwing errors. A minute later, the encryption layer flagged a failed handshake. At just past 2 minutes, the display showed exactly what he'd told the court it would. A cascade of exposed encryption keys live in the log, visible to any external process on the network. The court's consultant asked him to run it again. He did. The result was identical. The judge didn't deliberate long. He signed the emergency order at 9:47, 18 minutes after Cordant had opened for trading. The regulatory halt notice hit the exchange floor 4 minutes later. Marcus watched it on a tablet Doyle's assistant handed him, the trading volume line climbing cleanly upward, flattening out, then the red banner spreading across every terminal on the floor at once. Renata was still at the podium when it happened. Footage of her face in that moment would run for weeks across every financial news outlet in the country. A woman who had spent a decade building a story, watching it stop in real time. The regulatory investigation opened before noon, covering intellectual property theft, securities fraud, fraudulent concealment of assets, witness tampering, and destruction of evidence. Accounts tied to Renata and to Preston's shell network were frozen by early afternoon. Preston, on learning his own assets were locked, contacted his attorney within the hour and began negotiating cooperation, full testimony against Renata, in exchange for leniency. Loyalty, it turned out, had a price calibrated precisely to what he personally stood to lose. Cordant's board convened an emergency session that afternoon. By evening, the vote to remove Renata as CEO had passed without dissent. 3 days later, a group of institutional investors who'd been prepared to back the original IPO asked to meet Marcus directly. The platform had real infrastructure, real users, real underlying value. The problem was leadership that had destroyed its own credibility, and the only person who demonstrably understood the system at its foundation was sitting across the table from them. They asked if he'd consider taking it over. He told them he'd consider it under 4 conditions: a full public accounting of the platform's actual origin, and who had built it, direct notification and compensation for every user whose data had been put at risk by the vulnerability, protection through the transition for every employee who'd played no part in the fraud, and a complete replacement of the existing leadership before he agreed to anything further. They accepted all 4 before he finished the sentence. He suspected they'd expected him to ask for money first. Cordant was restructured under a new name, Alden Systems. His name on the building, not because he needed to see it there, but because the people trusting the platform with their money deserved to know exactly who was responsible for keeping it safe. His last conversation with Renata happened 3 weeks later, in a conference room belonging to her new, smaller, quieter legal team. She looked, for the first time in years, like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down, not by choice, but because her hands had simply given out. He slid an agreement across the table: full transfer of the platform's intellectual property, a public statement acknowledging his role in building it, full cooperation with the ongoing investigations, and complete relinquishment of any remaining authority over the company. In exchange, he wouldn't push for the maximum sentencing recommendations the preliminary findings supported. She read to the final page and found the addendum: modest monthly support payments for 36 months, the exact structure she'd once called generous. Her jaw tightened. "This is humiliating," she said. "It's the arrangement you personally described as generous," he said. She signed it, not gracefully. She signed it the way people sign things when the only alternative is worse. Then she gathered her things and left without looking at him again. 4 months later, Marcus stood at the window of his office, looking down at a city that, on a clear morning, looks less like a place where things go wrong and more like a place where things are still possible. On the desk behind him sat a newspaper with 2 photographs side by side: a man walking down courthouse steps with a duffel bag and nowhere obvious to go, and beside it, the same man walking toward a private jet on a small airfield. He thought about everything that had actually happened in between those 2 pictures. Hale had provided the aircraft and the resources. Doyle had built the strategy. Fitch had found the email. But none of it had been the deciding factor on the night Renata's team erased the files, bought off the witness, and called with an offer to make him disappear. What mattered in that moment was 14 printed pages, and the understanding that the knowledge behind them had never lived anywhere a server breach could touch. She had spent years convincing him it no longer mattered. She had been wrong. You cannot make a person's understanding of something they built disappear just by repeating, often enough, that it doesn't count anymore. He hadn't gotten his marriage back. He hadn't returned to the life he'd had before any of this started. What he'd built instead was something that couldn't be quietly erased, because it carried his name, publicly, legally, permanently, not because he'd fought for recognition for its own sake, but because the truth, once you stop apologizing for taking up space with it, tends to hold. If any part of this story has stayed with you, it's worth asking why. Most people never end up in a courtroom, and almost no one gets a jet landing outside one. But most of us have had some version of that moment, someone convincing us that what we built, what we gave, what we carried quietly for years, simply didn't count. And a lot of us walk away from that moment believing them. Marcus didn't fight because he wanted revenge. He fought because the only alternative was spending the rest of his life inside someone else's version of who he was. You don't need a private jet or a stolen company to understand what that costs, or to decide that the version of yourself other people find inconvenient is still the one worth standing behind.